Okay, is everybody cozy, happy in their seats? Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Bonsoir, mesdames et messieurs. My name is Martha Langford. Il me fait grand plaisir de vous accueillir, particulièrement Michel Campo, qui est avec nous, ce soir, au nom du département de l'histoire de l'art, à cette 5e conférence de la série Speaking of Photography 2013-14. The series is now ending its 7th year. That's not well phrased. It's ending its 7th year. I was going to say thanks to the continued support of our major donor. No, it's been a successful year thanks to the continued support of our major donor, Robert Graham. And I'm delighted to announce, Robert, thank you, that he will be continuing to support us into our 8th year in the fall. So hooray for Robert. Additional support comes from the Gail and Stephen A. Jaroslavsky Institute for Studies in Canadian Art, members of the AHGSA, the Art History Graduate Students Association, Chateau Versailles Hotel, and Ciel Variable magazine. Now, sadly, as I've just told you, this is the last lecture in the 2013-14 series, and a long, hot summer stretches out ahead. But in case you want to reminisce about all the happy times that we have spent together in the cool air of this auditorium, I'm happy to say that Jacques Doyon, editor of Ciel Variable, has just concluded an interview with me about the series. That's a piece that will appear in the spring issue, so I hope you will all have a chance to moon over it. Okay, now, our normal practice with the series has been to focus on the work of a single scholar who has presented on a single theme or project of their choice. Research partnerships have occasionally intervened, as with Robert Harriman and John Lukaitis, and my own collaboration with John Langford. This evening, we have something like a population explosion. 5 speakers delivering 6 short papers, and I want to take a moment just to explain how all this fits together. Elizabeth Cavaliere, Philippe Guillaume, Karla McManus, Sharon Murray, and Aurèle Parisien are members of the Canadian Photography History Research Group. There are other members, some here with us this evening, Samuel Gaudreau-Lalande, Michel Hardy-Vallée, who cannot be here, neither is Corina Ilea, Michelle McLeod, Pablo Rodriguez, Aaron Silver, and John Tuhi. And we also have some collaborators in our dissemination, Joanne Durocher-Norchet, Bahar Satelli, and Renee Witt, who are here this evening. So I also want to mention Jennifer Roberts, who was very, very important in the early stages of our organization, and we still benefit from her help. So many players then, but what's it all about? And what do we mean by this title, Imaged Communities, Putting Canadian Photographic History in Its Place? This set of papers came together as a collective response to the theme of meeting places, lieu de rencontre, an international Canadian Studies conference organized by St. Mary's University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and Mount Allison University in Sackville, New Brunswick. As you might gather from the title, the conference was a collective reflection on place-based communities and cultures within global and transnational contexts. This conference, which took place in September 2013, seemed a perfect opportunity to share some of the work that the Canadian Photography History Group had been doing, and the response was so positive that we decided to bring the presentation home to Concordia, where the research group is based. Imaged Communities imagines Canada as a network of photographic knowledge. The mapping of this network responds to questions about photographic experience that are motivating our research. What did Canadians know about photography, and when did they know it? We started asking these questions to construct a history of Canadian photography, a multi-voiced, multi-sourced account that exists already in the form of documents held by libraries, archives, and collections scattered across the country. We are working on the construction of an open-access guided tour of Canadian photographic history, taking both thematic and regional approaches and ranging between fine art and vernacular photographs in all of photography's forms. The Canadian photography history wants to create a new model. Our project intends to supplement the discipline's conventional, formal, and technical accounts with cultural histories of the medium as experienced by producers and consumers. And for this, we turn to under-considered publications from a wide variety of sources, many of which are quite far from art world sources. And we go to local history museums, science museums, and popular periodicals like National Geographic. This is where photographic art history, as produced by museums, archives, and academies, meets history from below, as consumed in the form of illustrated magazines, commemorative books, carte de visite, and snapshot albums, articles published in heritage magazines, and both the apparatus and ephemera of high art, including tiny catalogs, the ones that slip down between the cracks in libraries you can never find. So our photographic history has gone local, mindful, though, of the global trend in photographic studies to do just that. But while many of the larger institutions are merely dabbling in the vernacular, slimming, as it were, by livening up and popularizing their activities, we are committed to local knowledge and photographic experience as a way of thinking about Canadian photography and producing its history. This was the philosophy that drove our choice of topics, the papers that you will hear this evening. So we begin with a survey that inserts photography into the emergent field of settler art history. In Settling the West Through Image and Word, Karla McManus develops a cultural history of photography in the Canadian West, arguing that this body of literature, until now unconsidered as a whole, should be understood as a unique reflection of how photography, culture, and place have shaped the photographs and writings of Western Canadian photography. In other words, how they are reciprocally influencing. Liz Cavaliere then narrows the scope with her tale of two Ontario cities and their photographic self-definition. She compares two publications that function to establish a sense of place in two of 19th century Ontario's most prominent cities, Toronto and not Ottawa, but Kingston. We then move further east to New Brunswick with Aurèle Parisien. His study of the 1967 rediscovery of St. John's commercial photographer Isaac Erb complicates the nostalgia of Centennial Year with evidence from Erb's remaining archive, the original uses of the images, and the history of St. John's political economy. Having taken this archival turn, we then shift to a collection of photographs assembled by the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21 in Halifax, which was the primary port of entry to Canada between 1928 and 1971. This is Sharon Murray's paper, Pictures at the Port, which I will read on her behalf, a collective portrait of immigrants in a state of in-between. And finally, we come to one of the ways that photography delivers place, through the works of walking photographers. Philippe Guillaume has himself walked and photographed, and here he shares his study of the genre, what is revealed and preserved as a particularity of place. So, 5 lectures in one sitting. Members of the audience, how efficient are you? And so, let us proceed by welcoming Karla McManus to Speaking of Photography. Thank you.
All right. So I just like to say how great it is to give a talk and see a bunch of familiar faces in the audience. It's not that common. All right, so my title. My work for the Canadian Photographic History Research Project has focused on clarifying the role that photography has played in Western Canadian history, in an attempt to nuance what is sometimes dismissed as a regional concern. In this paper, I argue that Western Canadian photographers and the early writers of Western Canadian photographic history had a similar goal: to promote a particular sense of identity and place as seen through the camera's lens. This rather ambitious objective is meant as a provocation to you, my audience, and myself, a challenge to reconsider the value of regional history in today's transnational context. In this, I am echoing a concern that Western Canadian historians have explored throughout the 20th century, a debate that has richly engaged with ideas of myth-making, landscape, colonialism, Western exceptionalism, nationalism, and identity. Historian Richard Allen, one of the founders of the Canadian Plains Research Centre at the University of Regina, may have described it best and most poetically when, in the title of his 1973 book, he referred to the Western Canadian space as a region of the mind. Not surprisingly then, the theme I identified for my research contribution to our collaborative project draws on many of these concerns. The texts I have found move from the role of memory and place in Western Canadian photographic history to the reconsideration of regional and national identities, to the colonial transformation of landscape and people, particularly Indigenous peoples, but also settlers, as seen through the camera's lens. But what many of you may find surprising, as I did, is that I came to this theme, which I call photography settling the West, solely by looking at and reading about the images themselves. I did little historiographical research on Western Canada prior to initiating this project. Yet the fact that my research led me in this direction speaks, I think, to the strong impact that place and identity have had on Western photography. This parallel emphasis in photographic history and larger history of the Canadian West speaks to two aspects worth highlighting. One, that this significant, if slight, body of literature on Western Canadian photography that I'll speak of today is a coherent reflection of larger historical concerns. And two, that images and histories can become myth-making powers in their own right, canonizing, even at the most vernacular level, ideas and values that become impossible to separate from their precedents and from their creators. Many of the early photographers who plied their trade in the Canadian West were commercial resident and itinerant photographers, while others were amateurs, and their contributions, from the documentation of military presence in the West, the capturing of images of Indigenous peoples, to the photographs of the landscape for the purpose of infrastructure building and settlement design, created a valuable record of photography's first steps in the West. Some of the photographers are well-known figures today. Their images included in early Canadian histories and exhibitions, but most are not known beyond a small circle of interested researchers who are often from the very regions where the photographs were taken. This connection between regionality and proximity demonstrates the importance of what Lyle Dick has referred to as the vast and undervalued vernacular currents in Western Canadian history writing. In his essay from the collection, The West and Beyond, New Perspectives on an Imagined Region, Dick writes of vernacular history as a grassroots practice of telling local histories rather than official ones. This regionality does not, according to Dick, discount other layers of spatial influence, be they multi-regional, national, or transnational, but instead contributes to an understanding, a certain hybridity in form and genre. In photography studies, we have a similar understanding of vernacular photography as, and I quote Martha Langford, the everyday photographic experience gained through the making and seeing of images. This is another strong connection I see between the writing and the picturing of Western Canadian history. Many of the earliest writings on Western Canadian photography come from the local and regional historians and archivists and members of historical societies who helped to highlight the collections they discovered and to tell the stories of early photographers of the Canadian West. Beginning slowly in the 1960s and picking up in the 1970s, we can find an interest in highlighting Western Canadian photographic archives in publications such as Alberta History, The Beaver, and Manitoba Pageant. It was at this time that the study of photography was becoming more professionalized in Canada, as historians like Ralph Greenhill and institutions such as the Library and Archives Canada began publishing histories of Canadian photography. These publications tend to emphasize the technological and documentary qualities of early Canadian Western photography, while working to recover lost and forgotten material histories. Often there's an emphasis on narrativizing photographic history, as in works like Andrew Burrell's 1975 book, Into the Silent Land, Survey Photography in the Canadian West, 1858 to 1900, which describes the struggle of early photographers such as Humphrey Lloyd Heim during his 1858 expedition in the Western Interior and his triumphant overcoming of adverse conditions to achieve successful images. Other significant publications, such as Richard Haida's 1975 book on Heim, Camera in the Interior, 1858, H.L. Heim Photographer, The Assiniboine and Saskatchewan Exploring Expedition, focused on the important figures and moments of Canadian history. A similar vernacular approach can be seen in the pages of Alberta History, which published between 1977 and 1983 twice-yearly profiles of frontier photographers. Titles would often start with the name of the photographer and be followed by an epithet extolling their significance. Examples include G.H. Gano, pioneer photographer; Hugh Baton Biggs, ranch photographer; and A. Rafton Canning, Lethbridge photographer. These articles were primarily photo essay in format with little more than a biography drawn from provincial archive records. Most were unsigned. The professionalization of photographic history in Canada and the introduction of photographic studies to the disciplines of history, archival studies, museum studies, geography, and art history has helped raise the profile of these resources. Throughout the 1980s, there was a deepening of research into Western photographic history, particularly through the work of archivists such as Joan Schwartz in Ottawa, David Madison in Vancouver, and Brock Silversides in Regina. Their work often highlighted particular collections of photographers, but also an interest in photographic themes such as landscape, Aboriginal, or cowboy photography. There was also a growing focus on theoretical concerns as institutional histories of photography were critiqued for their formation of cultural identities and regional narratives. As well, the literature begins to mark a growing interest in histories from below, as the production of Chinese Canadian and women photographers was recuperated. During this time, we also see the beginning of photographic exhibitions in galleries and museums across the West, including Presentation House Gallery in Vancouver, the White Museum in Banff, the Glenbow Museum in Calgary, the Mendel Gallery in Saskatoon, and the Winnipeg Art Gallery. Exhibitions were also mounted in central Canada, primarily through the Canadian Museum of Contemporary Photography, emphasizing Western Canadian photography and cultural identity. Since the turn of the 20th century, histories of Western Canadian photography have become more nuanced, interdisciplinary, and analytic in approach, with a focus on the post-colonial criticism of Western photographic history. Matt Dice and Jim Opp have written about photography's role in shaping discourses about the North and Indigenous economic agency. Peter Geller has written about the role of the Hudson's Bay Company in shaping ideas about the North through photography. Carol Williams has written about how photography was used by settlers and First Nations alike in the shaping of identity in the early years of British Columbia. And Brian Osborne has analyzed the role of the Canadian National Railroad photographs of immigrants in reflecting governmental attitudes to assimilation. Alongside these more complex readings of Western Canadian photography, we continue to see photo histories about cowboys, strikes, floods, and the ever-picturesque Rocky Mountains. The richness of Western photographic history is located in this variety, where regional and hybridized ideas about identity and culture come to play. Always, there remains a strong tradition of amateur historical and photographic publishing in the West that reflects a fascination and identification with place, local roots, ancestral research, and frontier culture. Universities and archives across the Canadian West continue to play an important role in preserving and promoting Western Canadian photography by hosting many photographic exhibitions and producing publications from their archives. So the framework for Western Canadian photography that I have proposed today recognizes the significance of geography, culture, and place on the photographic history of the Canadian West, and on the photographers and authors who contributed to its development. It also leaves open to consideration and criticism the mythologizing and proselytizing that sometimes overwhelms the Western Canadian perspective. Keeping in mind the role of the vernacular in shaping the twin threads of history and photography, I wish to avoid any grand narratives or declarative conclusions. Instead, I will end today by urging you all to contribute to this project yourselves, by seeking out the many amazing collections of unknown photographs that remain to be studied, to look beyond the standard texts and histories when considering Western Canadian photography, and to question the photographs that make up your own personal region of the mind. Thank you.
So, A Tale of Two Cities, photography and self-identification of two emergent Ontario cities. Photography has often been used as a vehicle to define and shape the nature of a city and its self-image. Think of how often you've seen promotional photographs on pamphlets, postcards, websites, that in one image try to capture all that is quintessential about a particular city. Photography has played an equally important role in larger publications of local histories produced from within the cities themselves that rely on a multitude of photographs brought together to show a particular facet of the city. This paper will compare two such publications that work to establish a sense of place in two of Ontario's most prominent cities during the 19th century, and work to demonstrate that both can be understood as using photography to create a record of place-based community and identity. Let's have a look at the publications. First, Toronto Old and New. Toronto Old and New is a celebratory volume put together to mark the centennial anniversary of the Constitutional Act of 1791, whereby Quebec, according to the Parliament of Great Britain, was divided to grant a specific region to the Loyalist Anglophone settlers. Under this act, Upper Canada was formed and received English law and institutions. Graham Mercer Adam was the compiler of this memorial volume. Adam was a prominent bookstore owner in Toronto and also publisher of the British American Magazine in the 1860s, Canadian Monthly and National Review, and Canada Educational Monthly in the 1870s, along with publisher of books like Canada Historical and Descriptive from Sea to Sea, 1888, and a contributor to the ever-popular George Monro Grant's Picturesque Canada, 1882. All publications that work to define a particular aspect of Canadian identity. The publication of Toronto Old and New found its inspiration in the city's flourishing as a direct result of the division under the 1791 Act, which allowed Toronto to become, in Adams' words, a vast commercial emporium, a great railway center, the literary hub of the Dominion, the mecca of tourists and episcopal and archiepiscopal see, the ecclesiastical headquarters of many denominations, the seat of the law courts, the provincial legislature, the universities, colleges, and great schools of learning. Indeed, during this period, the population of Toronto, known as York until 1834, grew sixfold to a population of 180,000 by the time of publication. a volume created with great pride and zest for the development of a city from its first germ to full efflorescence, and characterized by the industry, intelligence, and integrity of its inhabitants, Toronto Old and New provides the reader with late Victorian period context and understandings of the city, its growth, and its inhabitants through both text and photography. The more than 300 photographic portraits of notable citizens, architectural photographs of homes, churches, and industry, as well as several cityscapes, visibly illustrate these accomplishments. Have a look at some of the pages. While also celebrating the achievements of a city, though this time from a retrospective vantage, Jennifer McKendry's 1998 Early Photography in Kingston provides a concise history of photographic development in Kingston, Ontario from 1839 to 1940, a comprehensive account of around 68 photography firms during this period, ranging from itinerant photographers with no real commitment to Kingston to resident ones working over decades and integrating completely into the city's life. With over 80 illustrations and photographs, McKendry has included a variety of plates that range from carte de visite to architectural photographs and portraits. In pulling together examples from a range of photographers working within different populations of Kingston and across a 100-year time frame, McKendry reveals a multifaceted portrait of Kingston on a level that cannot be achieved only examining one or two photographers in isolation. McKendry has self-published several books on various aspects of the history of Kingston. Her photographic history is one that emerges from her own embeddedness within the city, having started her historical interest and research on Kingston working with her father, Blake McKendry. So then, how do these publications manifest a self-interpretation and self-production of place-based community through the usage of photography? As a local history, McKendry's photographic history is particularly interesting as a source that has been created outside of the academic, archival, and museological institutions, though she makes clear that she is aware of key texts in photographic history by scholars such as Ralph Greenhill and Stanley Triggs. McKendry's advantage here is her grassroots approach to research, seeking out the help of the Kingston community and accessing everything from newspaper clippings to negatives that have been tucked away in family attics. As such, McKendry's contribution is one of intensive and comprehensive depth in compiling photographers who have left absolutely any record of a photographic practice behind. The type of research that McKendry has generated places the individual photographer in a continuum of photographers, some with extensive details and others with nearly none, that nonetheless provide a complete picture of a specific city's photographic evolution. Toronto Old and New uses the photograph as an illustrative device to create a who's who directory, showcasing both urban achievement and pride in Toronto's development, a necessary element in the establishment and conveyance of a city's sense of self-worth. And while it is important to examine the images from within their context of a celebratory volume, it's equally as important to examine what both the volume and the photographs exclude in their presentation of the city. Was Toronto such a complete success story? Did it not have any faults? Not even a single slum? In Toronto, it wasn't until the city medical health officer began producing reports on health in the slums in 1911, which included the photographs of Arthur Goss, that the city's working class, immigrants, and yes, too, its slums were acknowledged photographically in publication. Now, what implications do these publications provide research scholars hoping to study local histories of photography in Canada? What does taking such commemorative books seriously yield? Toronto Old and New, like a scrapbook or an album, offers up an insight into the particular personality of a city at a given moment in time. Toronto Old and New is one of many similar types of publications, both in the 19th century, like J. McManus' 1880 Illustrated Montreal, the Metropolis of Canada, which features many photographs reproduced as engravings by various Montreal photographers, predominantly William Notman, and even more recent ones, like Peter F. Adamson and Robert E. Jones's 1963 New Toronto Golden Jubilee booklet. Oh, I didn't think it was funny. For the photo researcher, these types of publications are valuable time capsules of the varied uses and types of Canadian photography. The celebratory and commemorative nature of these publications offer alternative accounts to the more documentary official reports and pamphlets, like those that feature the photographs of Goss. What a city celebrates about itself is equally as important as what it seeks to fix. Local histories of photography, presented through indices and lists of photographers, is an approach that is also not unique to early photography in Kingston, with several similar texts being produced through Ontario and Quebec. Early photography in Kingston, however, stands out among such local histories as it provides biographical sketches of photographers, plates of their photographs, as well as citations back to archival material. But there can be no doubt that these types of sources act both as departure points for more specific research on a particular photographer and as indices of photographic trajectories within a particular city. Where Toronto Old and New provides a counter to social documentary in its celebratory understanding of an emergent Toronto and all that it considers important and self-identifying as a new metropolis, early photography in Kingston, too, is a celebratory publication, but one that celebrates a local photographic history from the present. Likewise, as with Toronto Old and New, where the photographs yield information not only on what they include, but also what they exclude, McKendry, as a historian, can work to shape the photographic history of Kingston, in this instance, creating a photographic history that is comprehensive, finding historical value in photographic collections that may otherwise be overlooked by major museums and municipal archives alike. Photographic meaning in both instances comes not only from the compilers of the publications, who are invested in a celebration of place through photography, but also comes from the viewer, who can either extract the celebratory intention of these publications or can situate them within a broader historical and historiographical context in asking what can be learned from these publications about photography, about the city, and about ourselves. Thank you.
For reasons of sheer volume, we are just going to go through a change of PowerPoint. More on looking back into the past. There is nothing like unexpectedly stumbling onto a box of old photographs to open a window on to a place's past. The sharp and varied details lull the mind into a dozy, confident sense of certainty, while letting in the warm breeze of nostalgia to caress the imagination. In what follows, we'll catch a glimpse of this phenomenon in the form of the circulation of a body of vintage photographs of St. John, New Brunswick. And I'll try to muddy a bit the view they are taken to provide. My story concerns the photographs of the turn-of-the-century commercial photographer Isaac Erb, who operated a successful studio from the 1870s until his death in 1924 at 13 Charlotte Street, St. John. But although it begins there, it does not quite begin then. For after Erb's death in 1924, and the brief, lackluster continuation of the business by his son, John, who promptly died in 1939, Erb and his photographs passed quietly into oblivion. Along came a young photographer by the name of Lewis Wilson, who bought the studio from John's widow and launched his own photographic business and prospered. Until 1967, Canada's centennial year, Wilson had paid no or little attention to the boxes of glass plate negatives in the students' basement storerooms. But with the centennial fervor for all things historical, Wilson thought there might be some interest in the old pictures, and he printed up a bunch and offered them to 2 local newspapers, who enthusiastically published them in Dominion Day commemorative supplements in 1967. Wilson then perfected the printing of the vintage plates and began making the images available for sale, bringing a lost body of work back into circulation. As a result, in 1977, Camera Canada, a trade magazine for photo enthusiasts, published a special issue devoted to the Isaac Erb collection. Here it is. The boxes discovered by Wilson contained 3,000 negatives, about 1/4 of Erb's total production, consisting of the work Erb did, quote, on location outside of the studio from 1900 to 1924. As selected and published in Camera Canada, with sepia toning, of course, they encourage a nostalgic look back at heritage and rootedness in place and community, emphasized by the double spreads featured on the cover and full bleed centerfold. A few judicious then and now juxtapositions combine with the 2-page historical essay titled A Glimpse of Yesterday to establish a frame of gentle nostalgia and anecdote, of heritage and tradition mixed with optimistic innovation and confident continuity. The 52 Erb photographs reproduced convey the particularity and texture of place by showing us St. John's Harbor activity and ships, the logging and shipbuilding, which were traditionally the bases of the city's and the province's economy, shops and shopkeepers, tradesmen, institutional buildings and homes of the well-to-do, civic events and leisure, family gatherings and occasions, other local collectivities sprinkled with humor, and of course, also the bizarre and just quirky, hallmarks of the particular and authentic. The Erb photographs subsequently received considerable national as well as regional exposure and circulation. The still photography division of the National Film Board acquired 59 prints from Wilson and included them in Photo 77 in Ottawa, a blockbuster photo extravaganza attended by over 60,000 visitors, and then circulated them through its traveling exhibition program under the title Turn of the Century Photographs. Erb was featured in Richard Vroome's 1978 book, Old New Brunswick, a Victorian Portrait, and 2 volumes of St. John postcards, published in 1997 and 1998. Also in 1998, St. John at Work and Play, photographs by Isaac Erb, a 140-page picture book, appeared in New Brunswick. The several hundred photographs reproduced here are organized thematically along the same lines as the Camera Canada special issue, which it merely amplifies in volume. The generous captions provide more detail in terms of identifying the subjects depicted and related anecdote, but without additional insight regarding photographic, social, or historical significance. Over the 30-year period of the rediscovery of Isaac Erb, the rhetoric of transparent communication with a past of authentic place is repeated without ever trying to say what the images might tell us about it. What can such photographs tell us about place then or now and their subjects' relation to it, and the role of photography in it? And is the picture it gives really as unproblematically optimistic as it seems? Herb was certainly an accomplished craftsman, with an aesthetic flair for composition and clearly a good rapport with his subjects. But it is crucial to bear in mind that his was a commercial venture, which means that he probably never took a photo that he was not commissioned to take. So what is absent from these recent productions is any indication of the original function of the images, who they were taken for and why, and how they were presented, their original materiality. Take, for instance, this photograph, captioned simply New Brunswick telephone operators in Camera Canada. The rich tonality combined with visual simplicity, the diagonal perspective and repeated forms invites the reverence due the purest of straight photography. But before we get carried away by such aesthetic paroxysms, let's return to our postcard collectors, these compilers. These books provide almost no attributions to photographers, but in this case, two imperfect sources complete each other. Our photograph was produced for Ma Bell, in this instance, the New Brunswick Telephone Company, to advertise their services through the then new and hot medium of the postcard. Our nostalgic window has just become a bit less transparent, and photography itself a little bit more visible, a bit more opaque. For Herb's photographs are not whims of his singular inspired expression. They are a product of the constitutive material needs and forces of the place itself. So far, so good. And we'll see that the notion of switchboard, of place of exchange and transit, is particularly apt. The other thing, or things missing from the published selections, are just that, the things not selected. Lewis Wilson died in 1998, and the 3,000 Herb negatives were subsequently acquired by the Provincial Archives of New Brunswick. The glass plates are fragile, and no finding aid has been made. But the archives also have Wilson's complete set of 8x10 working prints. He printed every single one of the 3,000 plates over a course of an extremely long period of time. And I've had the great pleasure of going through those. On the whole, there are simply more versions and variations of the images we've already seen. But there are also two categories, omitted and elided: post-mortem portraits and arrangements of objects. It is obviously difficult to be nostalgic about the high death rate, the extremely high child death rate in the first decade of the 20th century. But let's focus on the other group, the stuff. They include toys, articles of clothing, such as shoes, lace collars, jewelry, handbags, pocket watches, haberdashery, grooming brushes, and whisks, vases, crockery, cutlery, goblets, tea biscuits, there they are, and much more. Most likely taken for advertisements or catalogs. We are dealing here essentially with still life, a genre which is, on the one hand, the most intimate. What is striking is the haptic quality of all these things, their things, the things they handled so intimately, the smoothness of the leather as they pulled on their boots, the weight and engraved texture of the watches in their pockets, the bristles stroking their faces, the biscuit under tooth. But on the other hand, as Norman Bryson argues, because still life addresses us on the level of our most basic creatureliness, It also denies individuality and particularity. It is for this reason, he thinks, that still life is relegated to the lowest level of artistic genres, made the most marginal. It can have a threatening power, and we consequently tend to repress it. But why, in the rediscovery of Urb's oeuvre, should these images be rejected? And what can this have to do with place? The absent presence of these images highlights another distortion. In contrast to the recent selective productions, the archive is dominated not by people, but by infrastructure projects. The expansion of port facilities, the building of rail beds and bridges, and an endless parade of warehouses, wholesalers, and retailers. JMS Careless, there's another one. JMS Careless, in his classic article, Aspects of Metropolitanism in Atlantic Canada, outlines how St. John's traditional economic basis of high-grade timber and shipbuilding collapsed in the late 19th century with the introduction of iron shipbuilding. In mid-century, fully 1/3 of the British Empire's merchant marine was built in St. John. The city had embarked on several railway schemes in order to try to dominate overland routes to the continental interior. But St. John was ill-placed for controlling the newly emerging continental system, where land access, not ocean access, was key. However, with its membership in the new Canadian Confederation, what St. John did have to offer was year-round access to the ocean. Through a combination of massive infrastructure development and political pressure to gain, wait for it, postal subsidies, St. John established itself, another industry that's about to disappear, St. John established itself at the turn of the century as Canada's winter port. And here is another Urb photograph of downtown St. John in its original postcard materiality. So the raison d'etre of St. John in the period of Urb's photographs had become that of a trans-shipping node in the emerging global consumer economy of manufactured things. Those elided objects are in fact at its center. It is for them that the roads and railways and bridges and ports are being built. And the more one contemplates the archive, the more it seems that all revolves around them. The shops and offices and schools and civic institutions and events and the people who fill them all depend on and consume these things. Their lives and every gesture are mediated by these manufactured things made by others, elsewhere. It is space and its structures of exchange and interconnections impinging very heavily on place and dwelling. They cannot be disentangled. The archive makes no bones about it, but perhaps it is too close to the bone. For those looking back from 1967 and later, desirous of a yesteryear less fraught with the ambivalences of today. There you are.
Wonderful. Okay. Thank you, Aurèle. Okay, I am now Sharon Murray. As the primary port of entry into Canada between 1928 and 1971, Pier 21 welcomed immigrants, refugees, soldiers, war brides, British guest children, and many others who landed on the shores of Halifax. Pier 21's significance to Canada's history is well recognized, as demonstrated by the number of books that have documented the story of this port. Many of these books are richly illustrated with images pointing to the fact that during its 43 years as an immigration station, countless photographs were produced at the pier of the people who passed through the station. Press and commercial photographers regularly stopped by the pier to photograph new arrivals, since it was always alive with people and therefore a prime place for photographic opportunities. Passengers on the boats, cameras in tow, would take snapshots of their first experiences of Canada, the family's first cup of tea at the pier's kitchen, or a group photograph of women and children in the Red Cross nursery. These are some of the types of photographs now part of the digital collection held by the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21. Established in 1998, the Pier 21 Immigration Museum began collecting oral histories, photographs, and memorabilia belonging to those who passed through the port. In 2010, Pier 21, a lot of numbers here, Pier 21, not good at that. Pier 21 became a national museum and was renamed the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21, and its collections mandate expanded accordingly. The museum's digital archive of images now numbers 28,000 and is largely composed of personal snapshots donated by immigrants, their children, and or their relatives. These include photos taken of immigrants just prior to departure from their homeland, shots taken on the ship en route to Canada, and images of their new lives and new homes, including what Carrie Ann Smith, the Chief of Audience Engagement and former manager of research, describes as the firsts. Photographs of a family's first car, first house, or first television set, and so on. The digital images in Pier 21's collections are a unique archive of the photographic experience of Canadian immigrants. The archive itself is a kind of meeting place, since it brings together images and memories of people who are now dispersed across the country and continent. What links these people together, however, and what Pier 21's archive records, is their shared experience of immigrating to Canada and, for the most part, their shared experience of place. Pier 21, there are a few photographs depicting people landing in other Canadian ports, such as Montreal, but Pier 21 is part of their expanded collection mandate as a national museum. Moreover, any collection of photographs representing an immigrant's life likely includes photographs from his or her native country, photographs that are often encoded with the visual and cultural traditions of that country. Pier 21's archive of images is therefore significant to Canadian photographic history, not only because of its content, but because it encourages us to reconsider the boundaries of national photographies. As the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21, the institution has developed a website that features stories and images that are part of their collection. While the museum's long-range goal is to offer open access to their digital archive, for the time being, only a small portion of their collection can be viewed online. The photographs published on their website include many images of the ships that docked at the pier, personal snapshots embedded within the online story collection. There is Ken Elliott's photo essay, A Day in May, Bert Wetmore's images of new immigrants, mainly children, and there are two collections of newspaper photographs taken at the pier. The Rats Collection, an unfortunate name for a pier, I think, and the Chronicle Herald Collection. I can understand that. Amongst these collections, a page entitled, Are You in This Picture? All right. Stands out from the rest. It contains 123 group photographs that appear to be taken by a range of anonymous producers, unlike the other coherent and authored bodies of images on the website. These images picture groups of war brides, staff and volunteers at the pier, soldiers embarking, ship passengers participating in parties and games, groups of immigrants at various stages of the immigration process, and numerous group portraits. both large and small, taken on deck of a ship that ferries newcomers to Canada. This collection of images offers a glimpse into Pier 21's archive of personal snapshots, the images donated by individual immigrants. But they also tell us something about what was considered photo-worthy, the desire to record and remember specific experiences during the migration period of these travelers. The posed group shots taken on deck resonate within the context of our research project on Canadian photographic history and in the context of meeting places where we first presented it. These images suggest a pattern, a motif within the varied content and style of the photographs attributed to Canadian immigrants. These group portraits were clearly produced quite regularly, given the number of them on this website alone. The similarity in their form suggests that this was a common means of representing the experience of being aboard ship. A group of smiling faces are pictured, gathered on deck. One of them, often a child in the center of the frame, holds or wears a life preserver marked with the name of the ship. A number of these photographs contain stamps or watermarks. They indicate that they were taken by a commercial photographer, someone hired as part of the ship's staff. Others reproduce the style of these commercial images by gathering more intimate groups on deck to have their photos taken, though often lacking the inclusion of the life preserver. These group portraits seem to paint a bright picture of the Canadian immigrant experience, people filled with hopes and dreams of making a new home in Canada. And yet, as Trudy Mittick and J.P. LeBlanc write about the experience of those landing at Pier 21, quote, "The exhausting journey, the faltering resolve, the money running out, the language and currency and customs all so new. This was almost too much for many immigrants to bear, a kaleidoscope of confusion threatening to overwhelm. Moreover, for some, their bright smiles seemed to belie the hardships experienced in their now former homeland, refugees and those seeking asylum in Canada. In the spaces of these photographs, people are captured together in a place in between, a gateway between past and future, old and new, memory and imagination. This is a liminal space, defined as much by what has been left behind as the space that they are moving toward. This in-between place is signified by the photographic act. A group has gathered to memorialize their journey, their shared experience of being aboard ship, and their experience of migration. In this sense, the photographs are relational objects, objects that, according to anthropologist and photohistorian Elizabeth Edwards, create and define relations between people. The photographic act is only one part of this process. The fact that the photographs still exist means that someone chose to hold on to them as a means of remembering their journey and sharing it with others, family, old friends, new friends, and so forth. This photograph likely was invested with personal memory and meaning, signifying the immigrant's physical voyage in as much as his or her inner journey to make Canada home. Moreover, by donating this image to Pier 21, this photograph too has undergone a change. Once an object of personal memory, it is now an object of cultural memory, signifying the photographic experience of Canadian immigration rather than the individual experiences of the person pictured. The relational role of these photographs is furthered by their placement on Pier 21's website. According to Carrie Ann Smith, the purpose of this page, Are You in This Picture?, is to gather stories and information about these photographs and the people pictured therein, since the donors provided few details about them. Furthermore, the staff at Pier 21 hoped that by posting these photographs, they might allow those who traveled together on their ships to reconnect. These photographs are records of a place where many of the subjects first met, a literal meeting place. Their placement on Pier 21's website, however, means that these photographs now are also a meeting place of memory, as the people pictured find their faces among the crowds. This is the afterlife of these photographic images. They are more than just records of the people on board, a visual ship's manifest. These photographs bring together those with a shared experience of place, the place in between, a home left behind, and a new one ahead, and a place of memory, the photographs themselves. These places converge in the virtual space of the museum's website. By gathering together images that represent the faces and histories of those who passed through the port, Pier 21 as a symbolic meeting place has been recreated on this page. As such, this archive of images on Pier 21's website is a unique collection of images that represent both real and imagined meeting places, places between home and away, past and future, places experienced and places remembered. Diasporic histories are, by nature, relational histories, and as such, the photographs that represent these histories are relational objects. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It's great to be on home ice, I guess. Since the 1960s, photographers in Canada have created distinctive photographic records and artworks that have enriched visual narratives of urban as well as rural places in the country. For some of these photographers, exploring or mapping their terrain by foot, literally or figuratively, is an inherent part of a methodology that also exposes changing cultural and social structures which otherwise often remain unseen. My contribution to the Canadian Photography History Project is both pan-Canadian and local. It is a historiography of the phenomenon based on statements and essays by artists and photographers, individual monographs, and other texts that concern photographic works that directly involve walking and its represented places and spaces. The decades following the first half of the 20th century were imprinted with changes and major transformations in the very core of Canadian cities. In the Maritimes, Ian McEachran photographed fringe areas of St. John, New Brunswick during the mid-60s, walking along dirt roads in the south end of the city, along which sidewalks were mostly non-existent and lined with wooden dwellings and shacks from the previous century. McEachran photographed the demise of these places on the margin of the city as they were about to disappear with the imminence of urban renewal. Meanwhile, in Vancouver, Fred Herzog's walks with his Leica were spearheading the use of color for street photography during a period when black and white was still the norm for serious documentary photography. As the artist Roy Arden pointed out during a conversation a few years ago, the corpus of photographs Herzog has produced during his walks since the 1950s are a striking testimony of the gradual transformation of a frontier town into a metropolis. During the early 1980s, Arden, who was also from Vancouver, walked the streets of his hometown, taking pictures inspired by German New Objectivity and Surrealism, which, as he notes, provided a mode of photography that could function as a lyrical but realist poetry, and reflects his experience of the world in a fashion that was personal but not autobiographical. Arden equates the peripatetic part of photography with seeing. The body of color transparencies he produced mirror an awareness of photographic aesthetic codes, but deliberately resist denoting place for the sake of, as he puts it, vision. In the 90s, Arden's urban studies showed a concern for a more objective and critical stand, often showing in his photographs the decaying of modern signifiers he encountered during his walks. Outdoor markets are pivotal zones in the city, often central to a neighborhood's sense of place. Beginning in the mid-50s and continuing throughout the 1960s, Michel Lambeth developed a personal project that was a creation of a portrait of Toronto. This work included roaming Toronto's St. Lawrence and Kensington markets, photographing people around stores and alleys, which resulted in an intimate portrait of local everyday activity in the tradition of humanist documentary photography. Meanwhile, in Winnipeg, John Paskovich's walks for his preservationist projects are also fueled with a keen awareness about inner city places. One among several such works he photographed, a series titled A Place Not Our Own, was done in the late 1970s. For this project, Paskovich walked and photographed the north end of Winnipeg, an area characterized by an intermingling of Canadian First Nations and European immigrants. In 1972, a group of photographers from Montreal based photographic collective traveled to the village of Disraeli to make a photographic record of Quebec society. Critically acclaimed by the photographic community, the photographs were taken by members of the Groupe d'Action Photographique, Claire Beaugrand-Champagne, Michel Campeau, Roger Charbonneau, and Cedric Pearson, who lived in the community for a few months for this work. The black and white photos they took of the agricultural families and blue-collar workers in the region were strongly inspired by the American social documentary tradition, and Walker Evans in particular. For many of the citizens of Disraeli and others, the images did not correspond to their own imagined photographic representation of their place. Hence, this place also became a contested space between local rural representation and the potency of the urban gaze in Canadian photographic history. During the same period, walking and photography became part of conceptual creative strategies for merging art and actions from everyday life, like walking. Projects like Françoise Sullivan's A Walk Between the Musée des Beaux-Arts and le Musée d'Art Contemporain, and Bill Vazin's Walking into the Vanishing Point, Boulevard Saint-Laurent, both created in Montreal in the 1970s, are striking examples. In the conceptual context of these different works, photography was no longer the ultimate connotation for the walk, but attributed an indexical role as a material trace of its occurrence. For Sullivan, her walk between the two museums was also a mnemonic space she created between two iconic places, taking pictures along the way. Vazin's walk up Boulevard Saint-Laurent, during which, always looking ahead, he took a snapshot at each street corner, shows the artist crossing a place by foot, replete with history, while heading toward a point at infinity in space. Boulevard Saint-Laurent is one of the oldest streets in Canada. Its sidewalks are palimpsests for local social histories, being deleted with the pressures of global and transnational politics. It is also a place where generations of photographers and artists have repeatedly walked. The following names are just a few examples: Raymond April, Melvin Charney, Serge Clément, Tom Gibson, Clara Gucci, Edward Hillel, Alain Leloup, Gabor Silassi, Sam Tata, and ATSA, ATSA, the acronym for Socially Acceptable Terrorist Action, founded by Pierre Allard and Annie Roy. In cooperation with the community, these artists installed a series of didactic panels with photographs illustrating various periods of its cultural history along the sidewalks of Saint-Laurent. Motivations for engaging with this place by foot are as various as the different cultures that have lived, worked, and created communities in neighborhoods along Saint-Laurent. The photographs that have resulted from these walks along this historic corridor show discrete preoccupations, which include representing home, narratives of place and space, social landscape, the built environment, politics of place, and place as didactic space, to mention but a few. Returning to Vancouver, Stan Douglas's Every Building on 100 West Hastings shows a more recent example of the transformation of place into a hegemonic stage. His seamless multi-image frontal panoramic photograph, taken at night, illustrates the physical and social transformation of an entire historic downtown city block and its sidewalks. A marginalized place at the heart of the city where an increasing homeless population live, often on the sidewalk, when it is not serving as a set for Hollywood movies or photographic productions. Place-based communities in different regions of the country have provided the terrain for photographers and artists concerned with critically documenting, exploring, and mapping different areas by foot. They have composed visual documents and artworks where the photograph's affect is as a realist representation concerned with photo history for some and as a poetic reference for others. These places have also been a space for the concrete application of conceptual art. During the closing decade of the last century, Canadian photographers all but stopped walking. Increasing interest for a first-person voice over the collective spirit that had emerged during the 60s meant that photographers were covering less distance by foot, as they concerned themselves more with what was in their immediate realm. This decline continued with the increased presence of digital photography and the availability of new visual technology like Google Street View. In the province of Quebec, street photography was virtually stifled, following legislation introduced in 1998, rendering illegal to publish photographs of anyone without their consent, including in public spaces like along the sidewalk. It is significant to remember that the act of walking, be it through art performance or photographic representation of its space, includes an active verb. To walk is an action that resists the time-space densification that constitutes a salient part of the condition of postmodernity. The photographer's walks lead them not only from one place to another, but into a complex interplay of place and space that involves what David Harvey calls form or anti-form. This brings out the possibility for open interpretations where place and space can merge. What this also means is that the study of photography and walking is not about inside or outside, a center or a periphery, but akin to another space where differences converge through this creative binary. As a result, new ways to help us remember the richness of place-based communities and pressures facing these places and spaces across the country can continue to be uncovered. Thank you.
So, as is our habit, we have time for some questions. If you have the questions, we have the time. Is that sexy? Let's get a little light on the subject here.
Okay.
Yep. Get the team full. Yep. Get the team up. Here's the team. Okay. So, questions? Anybody? What the heck are you doing, Zoe? Yeah.
It's a question for any of you and all of you. I wonder if you could say a bit about the possibility of writing the history of Canadian photography in a local vernacular way in which the concept of space or place is not a determining concept. So what other concepts can we use to think about Canadian photographic history?
Well, there's
Can you repeat the question?
The question is, what other concepts beside place or space could be used to write a Canadian photography? That's scary. And I guess, well, I guess I would say that the answer has somewhat been written by Gillian Rose in her book on family photography, where she's, very much at ease with sort of social networking as a place for photographs, so that spaces are created which are, regardless of the diaspora of the family and so forth, are creating sort of tentacles, networks of other kinds of connections. I think that Aurèle was touching on some aspect of that, and some very interesting activist work is being done at the moment, where people are documenting the making of something, and then they're following that object, from raw material to its completion, to its consumer good. That creates another kind of map, which is possible, and I think becoming more possible. So those would be two of my answers. Water.
I mean, space is such a useful way to think about a kind of national body of photographs. I guess maybe I hinted at a few different ideas as well. You could think about the notion of myth-making or identity as a major force in understanding a national history of photography.
Yeah, I think with Jennifer McKendry's early photography in Kingston, it all happens to take place in Kingston, but really she's creating a kind of manifest of photographers. So she's creating a history of photography via the photographers themselves, and sure, that creates a sense of community in place, but in terms of actually going about writing the history, it's a history of the people who happen to be in that place, creating a kind of continuum.
That's very old school.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful exhibition I want to draw your attention to in the Webster Library right now. I say I'm going to draw your attention to it because it's very easy to miss. Next time you're bringing a book back, and hurry over and do that tonight, there are 4 cases right by the drop box. You've seen this? And it's I guess it's the Haitian community, and what's interesting there is with 4 glass cases, big vitrines, only one set of photographs, one of the vitrines represents photographs taken in Canada. But what do you do with that? That's Canadian photographic history. I think it's something that people are just kind of beginning to wrap their minds around. Such a simple concept, but it needs to be thought about.
Maybe I'll just add a detail. I guess if you're talking about photographic history of a country, countries are spatially located, so it's pretty hard to escape the construct of place. So I'm interested in materiality, right? Photographic materiality. It comes up in Sharon's, the paper that Martha read for Sharon as well, that once you think of, because we can think of photographs as, in Benjaminian terms, as just this infinitely reproducible image, which consequently is kind of dematerialized and doesn't exist anywhere. But again, once you start thinking about photography materially, then the photographs become objects. That's why I'm interested in photographs of objects, and that this kind of mise en abîme collapses, and then objects are always situated somewhere. Right? So we're back with the inescapable framework of place. And perhaps in Canada it has a particular significance since, as Northrop Frye said, the question of Canadian identity should not be who are we, but where is here. So in Canada in particular, space and place has a very particular intimate connection with the notion of the Canadian nation.
Well, one of my driving motivations is, of course, walking. And when we're thinking about walking, space and place are 2 elements that continually interplay. Walking is always dealing with space and with place. I'm thinking also of all these Canadian photographers, artists that I'm looking at, I'm discovering. And many of them have also created bodies of works that are outside of Canada. So in fact, they're bringing their their Canadianness outside. I'm thinking here particularly of Robert Walker, images he did in New York City, for instance. I'm thinking of Phil Bergerson, his 10-year project throughout the U.S. So these are prime examples for me of the way place and space are really important elements that I don't want to push aside. They're not cliches for me. These are really important areas of reflection from which I can start to think further on to this relationship, this binary between walking and photography. So in terms of bringing that out as something Canadian, I think, yes, there is something Canadian, and writing about it, there's a lot, I think, that can be dug out of that association by thinking about place and space.
Jill?
It strikes me that Jens Jaeger's piece on the comparison of landscape photography in England and pre-unification Germany is an example where place and space are not part of German identity, but it was about portraiture of intellectuals, poets, the great, prominent public figures. And I think that that's another framework that does not deal with, it deals with place, but not in the same way. That this notion of Germanness in pre-unification Germany was not about landscape, it was not about space, territory, feet on the ground, walking, it was about what was going on in the mind.
Mm-hmm.
But don't we see this intertwined in Toronto Old and New? I think that's
absolutely.
the element.
The Who's Who directory, right? It's all about the people that are in that place, what they're doing, what they're contributing to the community of Toronto, the culture of Toronto. Absolutely.
Did you compare it with Borthwick's Montreal, 1875, which is probably a model for that Toronto book?
Oh. Homework.
Any other questions? Stomachs are grumbling. Drink and a think. Listen, folks, this is the end for this year. You've been such a great and faithful audience. Thank you so much. And please watch the website because we're coming at you next year with another series and look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you very much.